The evening was heavy with clouds when Richard drove through the narrow countryside road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than ever before. The clock on the dashboard blinked mercilessly, 5:42 p.m., and every second seemed to stab his chest with guilt. His son's wedding had started at 5. He had promised he wouldn't be late. He had promised his son that this time, he'd be there, right in the front row, smiling, clapping, and watching him begin his new life. But the world had other plans. The flat tire, the unexpected traffic, the wrong turn, everything seemed designed to punish him for being late again. And as the rain began to fall in cold silver lines against the windshield, Richard felt the weight of his failures pressing harder than ever before. He still remembered that day. The smell of wet asphalt, the dull sound of thunder in the distance, and the faint echo of church bells calling in the distance. The bells rang like reminders of the life he was missing, his son's life, the one he had slowly drifted away from over the years. He could almost see it in his mind, the white tent, the laughter, the music, and his son standing proud in his black suit, probably scanning the crowd for his father, and not finding him. The thought pierced him. Richard's mind was full of memories as he sped through the last stretch of the road. He remembered when Daniel was just a small boy, running through the backyard with mud on his shoes and joy in his eyes. Those were the days when they were inseparable, father and son against the world. But things had changed. Life, work, and pride had come between them. And after Richard's wife passed away, the silence between them grew louder. Words became fewer. Calls went unanswered. Birthdays missed. And yet, somehow, Richard believed that attending his son's wedding would fix everything, that his presence alone would speak the words his heart had kept hidden for years. But now, as the car finally turned into the church parking lot, he realized how late he really was. The place was alive with soft lights and laughter. Cars were neatly parked, and the faint sound of music floated in the air. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, his heart beating in uneven rhythm. His reflection in the rearview mirror showed an older man, tired eyes, unshaved chin, suit slightly wrinkled. He didn't look like the father of a groom. He looked like a man who had lost his place in his own story. Rain dripped down his windshield as he stepped out, clutching the small velvet box in his hand. Inside it was the old silver watch that once belonged to his father, a gift he had planned to give Daniel on this day. It was supposed to symbolize 3 generations of men who, despite their flaws, carried love in silence. But as Richard stood in the rain, staring at the glowing church windows, the laughter spilling from inside told him one thing: he was too late. He walked slowly toward the building, his shoes sinking slightly in the wet gravel. Every step echoed the years he had missed, the games he hadn't watched, the birthdays he hadn't attended, the calls he hadn't returned. He could hear faint music now, soft piano chords and a woman's laughter. It was the sound of joy, the kind of sound that once used to belong to him, but now it belonged to someone else. When he reached the large wooden doors, he hesitated. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the handle. What would they think if he walked in now? The ceremony would be over. Everyone would be inside, celebrating. His son, his new daughter-in-law, their families, their friends. And him, just a shadow standing outside. But his heart whispered that he needed to go in. He needed to see it, even if it hurt. Even if it broke him completely. The sound inside grew louder as he pushed open the door just a crack. Warm golden light spilled into the night air, brushing his face with the feeling of life he no longer felt part of. He could see the backs of people, the soft glow of candles, and then, his son. Daniel stood near the front, arm around his bride, smiling in a way Richard hadn't seen in years. His laughter filled the room, genuine and strong. And around him, people clapped and cheered. Richard froze. His eyes watered instantly, not because of the beauty of the moment, but because of what it meant. His son had found happiness. Without him. He had found a family. Without him. He had learned to laugh again. Without him. And as Richard stood there, soaked from the rain, heart sinking deeper into regret, he realized this was what true heartbreak sounded like. The sound of joy that didn't need you anymore. For a moment, he thought about stepping inside. Maybe Daniel would forgive him. Maybe he'd smile and say, "Dad, you made it." Maybe it wasn't too late. But then Richard heard something small but sharp enough to freeze him where he stood. It was Daniel's voice. "You know, Mom would have loved this day," he said, smiling at his new wife. "But Dad, well, I stopped waiting for him years ago." The word struck harder than lightning. Richard felt his breath catch. The world around him blurred as the laughter continued, as if the universe wanted him to hear that one sentence again and again. He leaned back against the wall outside the church, feeling his knees weaken. He had imagined this reunion 1,000 times, but never like this. Never as a ghost on the outside. The rain began to pour harder now, drowning the sound of celebration, but not enough to silence his son's voice that still echoed in his mind. He wanted to scream, to cry, to explain. But what would he say? "I'm sorry" had lost its meaning long ago. Years of absence could not be healed by one late appearance. And yet, his heart refused to leave. He couldn't drive away. Not yet. He stood there for a long while, until the ceremony inside turned into music and dance. People were laughing, singing, clinking glasses. Through the glass window, Richard saw Daniel and his bride dancing slowly under the soft golden lights. They looked perfect. Happy. Whole. And then, for a moment, Daniel looked toward the door. Richard froze again, stepping back quickly, hiding behind the wooden pillar. His breath caught in his throat. Did his son see him? Did he recognize the shadow at the door? But Daniel only smiled, looking past him, at something else. Richard let out a shaky breath. The rain had soaked him completely now, his suit clinging to his skin, his shoes squelching with water. He looked like a man who didn't belong anywhere. He thought about leaving, driving back to the empty house, pretending he had never tried. But then he remembered the watch in his hand. The small velvet box that carried a promise across generations. He couldn't leave without giving it to his son. No matter how much it hurt, he had to do that one thing right. He walked slowly along the side of the church, searching for another entrance, something quieter, less crowded. He found a narrow path that led to the back, where the kitchen lights glowed softly. The air smelled of food and flowers. He could hear muffled laughter through the walls. He stood there, heart pounding, rehearsing what he would say if he met his son face to face. "Daniel, I'm sorry. I should have been there. I should have been better." But every time he tried to form the words, they stuck in his throat. Then he heard footsteps. A woman's voice, soft and calm. "Sir, are you all right?" Richard turned quickly. It was one of the wedding staff, a young woman holding a tray of dishes. Her eyes widened as she saw the soaked old man standing in the rain. "You're drenched. Do you need help?" she asked. He shook his head quickly, forcing a small smile. No, I'm fine. I'm just a little late, that's all." She frowned. "Late? Are you a guest?" He looked away, hesitating. "Something like that." The woman tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "If you're here for the wedding, you can still go inside. They're having dinner now. You'll be fine." Richard smiled sadly. "No, I think I'll just stay out here for a bit." The woman nodded slowly, clearly unsure. "All right, sir. But don't stay too long in the rain." She disappeared back into the warm light of the kitchen, leaving him alone once again. He sighed and leaned against the wall, feeling the cold seeping through his clothes. He could hear laughter echoing again, closer this time, maybe through an open window. And then, something changed. The laughter faded slightly, replaced by a new sound, Daniel's voice again, quieter now, almost thoughtful. "I just wish Dad could have seen this," Daniel said softly. "Even after everything, part of me still wanted him here." Richard's heart jumped. He stepped closer to the window, holding his breath. His son was sitting near the table, talking to his wife. She reached out and touched his hand. "Maybe he'll show up later," she said kindly. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. He won't. He never does." Richard's hand tightened around the box. His throat burned with words he couldn't speak. He wanted to rush in and prove his son wrong, to show that he had come, even if it was too late. But his legs wouldn't move. His guilt was heavier than his courage. And then, suddenly, Daniel stood up. "I'm going to get some air," he said. Richard's heart stopped. Was he coming outside? He looked around frantically, searching for a place to hide. His eyes landed on the side gate, a small wooden door leading toward the garden. He stepped through it quickly, hiding in the shadows just as Daniel appeared at the back entrance, looking out into the rain. Daniel stood there, hands in his pockets, breathing in the cold air. He looked older than Richard remembered, taller, more serious, yet somehow still that little boy who used to wait for him on the porch every evening. The sight nearly broke him. Richard took one small step forward, whispering softly, almost to himself, "Daniel." But before he could say another word, Daniel turned toward the garden, his eyes narrowing as if he heard something. And then he started walking in Richard's direction. Rain still whispered through the leaves as Daniel stepped out into the dimly lit garden. The night was calm except for the soft tapping of water dripping from the roof and the distant hum of music from the hall. Richard froze near the old wooden fence, his breath shallow, every nerve in his body trembling. The garden lights cast faint circles of yellow across the wet ground, and Daniel's shadow moved slowly through them. Richard's heart pounded. He hadn't been this close to his son in years. Every step Daniel took toward him made time stretch painfully slow. The boy he had once taught to ride a bike was now a man, strong, confident, yet carrying the quiet sadness of someone who had learned to live without something important. Richard wanted to call out, to say something, anything. But his voice refused to come out. The moment felt too fragile, too sacred. One wrong word could shatter it completely. So he stood there in silence, hidden behind the low branches of the garden tree, gripping the velvet box so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "I still remember that night," Richard whispered to himself, barely audible, as a flash of lightning lit up the garden. It was the night his wife, Emily, had passed away. The night everything began to fall apart. Daniel was 17 then, furious, broken, and too young to understand that sometimes love hides behind silence. That night, Richard had promised himself he'd protect his son from everything. But instead, he had protected himself from the pain, and that decision had built a wall between them that now stood taller than ever. Daniel paused near the center of the garden, lifting his face toward the sky. The rain had softened to a mist, glistening on his dark hair and shoulders. He exhaled, and in that breath, Richard could hear exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying years of unspoken words. Richard finally stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Daniel." Daniel turned sharply. His eyes scanned the shadows until they found him. For a moment, both of them froze, father and son, strangers separated by time and pride. "Dad?" Daniel's voice carried disbelief, almost confusion. Richard swallowed hard. "Yes, it's me, son." Daniel took a step forward, eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Richard forced a smile that barely held together. I came to see you. To be here." Daniel laughed softly, though it wasn't from amusement, it was the kind of laugh that hides old pain. "You came now? The ceremony's over, Dad. You missed it." "I know," Richard said quietly. "I tried, I really did. The car broke down, then." Daniel raised a hand, cutting him off. "There's always something, isn't there? Always some reason why you couldn't make it." The words hit like stones. Richard looked down, raindrops falling from his hair. "You're right," he admitted softly. There's always been something. But not tonight. Tonight, I just wanted to be here for you. I didn't want to let you down again. Daniel's expression hardened. You already did. The silence that followed was long and heavy. The music from inside sounded distant now, muffled by the sound of rain. Richard wanted to say something to make it right, but nothing seemed enough. Years of absence could not be undone by one wet apology in a garden. I wanted to give you this, Richard finally said, opening his trembling hand. The small velvet box gleamed faintly under the light. Daniel hesitated before stepping closer. What is it? Richard opened the box slowly, revealing the old silver watch inside. It glowed softly, its glass scratched from time but still ticking faithfully. It was your grandfather's, Richard said. He gave it to me on my wedding day. I wanted to pass it on to you. Daniel looked at the watch for a long moment. His face softened slightly, but his voice remained quiet. It's beautiful, he said. But, Dad, it doesn't change anything. I know, Richard replied. It's not supposed to. It's just something that's always been passed from father to son. I didn't want that chain to break, even if I already broke everything else. Daniel looked down, eyes clouded with conflict. You missed everything important, Dad. Mom's funeral, my graduation, my birthdays. You were always busy. Always too far away. You think one gift fixes that? No, Richard said, stepping closer. I don't think it fixes anything. I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry. I know I failed you. I know I wasn't there when you needed me most. But I'm here now, Daniel. Not as an excuse, just as your father. Daniel looked away, jaw tight. I waited for you for years. You know what hurt the most? It wasn't that you weren't there. It's that I stopped believing you ever would be. Richard's eyes filled with tears. I deserve that, he whispered. The air between them grew cold. The rain had stopped, leaving only the quiet sound of drops falling from the trees. Daniel stared at his father for a long moment, as if searching for something real in his eyes. And for a fleeting second, Richard thought he saw it, the boy who used to run into his arms after every little victory. But then, Daniel stepped back. I need to go back inside, he said quietly. They'll be looking for me. Daniel, please, Richard said, his voice breaking. Just give me a chance to talk. 5 minutes. That's all I ask. Daniel hesitated, then sighed deeply. Fine. 5 minutes. Richard nodded, relieved. They sat on a wet bench near the garden's edge. The faint sound of laughter from inside drifted through the night air. I know I can't change the past, Richard began softly. But you need to know, when your mom died, I didn't know how to live without her. I thought staying away from everything that reminded me of her would help me survive. But I didn't realize I was also staying away from you. Daniel's eyes flickered with pain. You left me alone, Dad. I was 17. I needed you. Richard nodded, voice trembling. I know. And I'll regret that every single day I have left. They sat in silence for a while. The sound of the rain had become comforting, almost peaceful. Then Daniel spoke quietly. You should have called. Richard smiled sadly. I did. A few times. But you never answered. Daniel frowned, confused. I never got any calls. Richard hesitated. I called from my old number, the one you blocked after the argument. Daniel froze. He remembered that day vividly, the fight, the anger, the words he had shouted in pain. He had blocked his father's number and told himself it was for the best. He didn't think his father would ever try again. Richard looked down at the watch in his hand. I kept calling for months. Then, after a while, I thought maybe you were better off without me. So I stopped. Daniel's chest tightened. You could have come in person. Richard gave a hollow laugh. I was afraid you wouldn't open the door. They both fell silent again. The distance between them felt smaller now, but still fragile, like a cracked mirror that could shatter again at the slightest touch. Finally, Daniel exhaled. You should come inside. You look like a mess. Richard smiled weakly. You'd let me? Daniel shrugged. It's my wedding. I think I get to decide who's welcome. The words were small, but they lit something inside Richard's chest. Hope. A fragile, trembling hope. They walked back together toward the hall. Through the windows, the warm light spilled across the wet garden, and the sound of laughter grew louder. When Daniel opened the side door, every eye turned toward them. For a moment, the room went quiet. The bride, standing near the table, looked surprised but smiled politely. This is my father, Daniel said softly, his voice barely above the music. Some people clapped lightly, others just nodded. The bride stepped forward and smiled kindly at Richard. I'm so glad you could come, she said warmly. Richard forced a small smile. Thank you. You look beautiful. She blushed slightly and turned to Daniel. Come, the photographer is waiting. Daniel nodded and turned to his father. Stay here, Dad. I'll be right back. Richard nodded, his heart full but uncertain. He stood quietly near the edge of the room, watching the celebration unfold. People were dancing, laughing, raising glasses. For the first time in years, he saw his son smiling, not a forced smile, but one filled with peace. And then, in that moment, Richard felt something strange. A hand tapped his shoulder. He turned, expecting maybe one of Daniel's friends. But the man standing there was someone he didn't recognize, tall, serious-looking, wearing a dark suit and a quiet frown. You're Daniel's father? The man asked in a low voice. Yes, Richard replied cautiously. The man's eyes flickered with something unreadable. You might want to step outside for a moment. There's something you need to see. Richard frowned. What is it? The man didn't answer right away. He simply said, It's about your car. It's urgent. Richard hesitated but nodded. He followed the man through the side door, back into the quiet rain. The music faded behind him, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves. They walked past the garden and around to the parking lot, where Richard's old car sat under a streetlight. Is something wrong? Richard asked. The man turned slowly, his expression unreadable. Depends on what you call wrong. Before Richard could reply, the man opened his coat slightly, and Richard's blood ran cold. There, tucked inside his jacket, was a small badge. One that didn't belong to a wedding guest. Mr. Harris, the man said quietly. We need to talk. Richard's stomach dropped. The joy, the fragile peace, all vanished in an instant. Who are you? He asked, voice trembling. The man's eyes were calm, almost regretful. Police, he said softly. We've been looking for you. The air outside had turned colder. A thin mist floated above the wet pavement as Richard stood frozen, staring at the man's badge glinting faintly under the streetlight. The officer's calm voice echoed through the silence like thunder after lightning. Police? Richard repeated slowly, barely able to form the word. Yes, the man said quietly, lowering his hand but keeping his eyes fixed on Richard. Detective Moore. We've been trying to reach you for several days now. Richard blinked, confusion flooding his mind. Me? Why? What's going on? Moore exhaled deeply, his tone steady but grave. We need to talk about something that happened 2 nights ago. Rain began to fall again, soft but steady. It sounded like whispers all around them, blending with the faint laughter still spilling from the wedding hall. Richard's heart began to pound again, louder this time. 2 nights ago? He asked. I don't understand. The detective nodded toward the car. Why don't we sit for a moment? Richard hesitated, his gut tightening. Something about Moore's tone didn't feel routine. This wasn't about a broken taillight or a parking issue. This was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to hear. But curiosity and fear drove him forward. He opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat, watching the detective lean against the frame. Moore's eyes were calm, but his face carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much. Mr. Harris, he began slowly, do you know a woman named Margaret Dyer? The name struck like a cold splash of water. Richard frowned. Yes, she's my neighbor. She lives across from me. What about her? Moore nodded slightly. We found her dead in her home 2 nights ago. Richard's stomach twisted. What? He whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. Dead? No, that can't be right. I saw her just last week. She said she was going to visit her sister. Moore's eyes didn't move. I'm afraid it's true. We believe she died the same night she was supposed to leave town. Richard sat back, stunned. Margaret had been one of the few people he still spoke to since moving to the quiet street outside the city. She would wave to him from her porch, bring him cookies during holidays, and occasionally scold him for letting his mailbox overflow. She reminded him of his late wife in some small way, gentle but firm, kind but always curious. Oh, God, Richard muttered, rubbing his temples. That's terrible. Moore waited a moment before continuing. We found something strange at the scene. There was a small letter on her kitchen table. It had your name on it. Richard's head snapped up. What? Yes, the detective said. It wasn't mailed. It was written, sealed, and left there. Her sister confirmed that Margaret intended to give it to you before she left. Richard started to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about this. Moore nodded slowly. That's what we're trying to figure out. Because, Mr. Harris, her death wasn't an accident. The world seemed to tilt. Richard felt his pulse quicken, his palms growing cold. You're saying she was murdered? Yes. The word hung in the air like smoke. The rain hit harder now, drumming against the car roof. Richard stared through the windshield, watching droplets slide down in crooked lines. I swear, he said after a long pause, I had nothing to do with that. I didn't even know she was dead until you told me. Moore studied him carefully. I believe you, Mr. Harris. At least, I want to. But there's something else you should know. Richard looked up, his voice shaking. What? Moore reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside was a folded note, faded and wrinkled. This was in her handwriting, the detective said. It simply says, tell Richard he was right. Richard stared at the note as if it were a ghost. His mind spun. Tell Richard he was right, he repeated. About what? That's what we were hoping you could tell us. Richard shook his head slowly, trying to piece things together. I don't know. I don't understand what she meant. Moore leaned closer. You said you saw her last week. Did you talk about anything unusual? Did she mention feeling unsafe? Or mention anyone new around? Richard thought hard. We talked about her sister, about her garden, nothing strange. Wait, he paused, remembering something faint. She did say something odd the last time I saw her. She said, some people know too much for their own good. I laughed it off. I thought she was joking. Moore frowned slightly. Did she say who she was talking about? No. And I didn't ask. She was always reading those crime books. I thought it was one of her stories. The detective sighed and closed the bag, sliding it back into his coat. We're not accusing you of anything, Mr. Harris. But considering the letter, we had to find you. And you weren't answering your phone. Richard blinked. My phone? I lost it. Somewhere on the way here. I was driving to my son's wedding, and everything just went wrong. Moore nodded, his voice softening a little. I get it. But we may need you to come in tomorrow to answer some questions. I'll give you my card. He handed Richard a small, damp business card. Richard took it with trembling hands, staring at the detective's name. Can I ask something? Richard said. Of course. Do you think she was killed because of me? Moore paused. For the first time, his eyes shifted away. We don't know yet, he said quietly. But her letter suggests she was trying to reach you for a reason. If she knew something important, maybe she thought you did too. Richard's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, but deep down, something uneasy stirred inside him. A flicker of memory, something Margaret had mentioned months ago about seeing a strange car parked outside their street late at night. She had joked about it, but he remembered her saying, if anything ever happens to me, you'll know who to tell. He had laughed then, not realizing she might have been serious. Mr. Harris, Moore said, breaking his thoughts, I'm sorry to bring this to you tonight. Especially here. I know it's your son's wedding. Richard nodded slowly, still lost in thought. It's fine, he murmured. Just, please, find out what happened to her. Moore gave a respectful nod. We will. He turned to leave but stopped midway. One more thing, when was the last time you were home? Richard frowned. Yesterday morning. Why? Just checking, Moore said. If you think of anything unusual, any missing items, strange calls, let me know immediately. With that, he walked off into the mist, his dark coat blending with the shadows. Richard watched him disappear, feeling the world tilt around him. The rain began to fall harder, soaking through his jacket. His mind buzzed with questions that had no answers. He leaned against the car, taking a deep breath. The joy from earlier, the brief spark of reconnection with his son, felt miles away now. All he could hear was the detective's voice echoing in his mind, tell Richard he was right. Right about what? As he stared at the ground, something small glimmered near the tire. He bent down and picked it up, a small silver key. It wasn't his. It was old, engraved with the letter M. Margaret. Richard's hands trembled. How had it gotten there? He looked around, but the parking lot was empty. Only the faint sound of laughter from the hall reached him now, distant and unreal. He slipped the key into his pocket, his heart racing faster with every passing second. He knew one thing for sure, he couldn't tell Daniel about this. Not tonight. Not after everything. He straightened up, wiping rain from his face, and walked slowly back toward the hall. But as he reached for the door handle, something made him stop. Through the thin glass, he could see Daniel dancing again, smiling, his arm around his new wife. But behind them, standing near the far wall, was a face Richard didn't recognize, a man in a dark gray suit, watching him through the glass. The man didn't smile. Didn't move. Just watched. Richard's breath caught. When he blinked, the man was gone. He pushed the door open quickly, scanning the room, but there was no sign of him. Guests were laughing, waiters were serving wine, and the band was playing soft music. Everything looked normal, except for the unease crawling beneath Richard's skin. He slipped quietly to the corner, pretending to adjust his jacket. His mind raced, Margaret, the detective, the letter, the key, the stranger in the gray suit. Nothing made sense, but deep inside, he knew this wasn't random. Then his phone buzzed. He had found it earlier inside the car. The screen flickered with an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello? For a moment, only static. Then a woman's whisper. Soft. Shaky. Richard, you shouldn't have come tonight. His entire body froze. Who is this? But the line went dead. He stared at the phone, heart hammering. The voice, it sounded faintly familiar. Almost like Margaret's. But that was impossible. Wasn't it? The phone slipped from Richard's hand and landed on the wet gravel beside his shoe. For a long second, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at it, the rain dripping from his hair, his mind spinning in terrified silence. The voice. It couldn't have been her. It couldn't. Margaret Dyer was dead. The detective had said it himself. He had even shown the letter. Yet the whisper that came through the static was hers. He would never forget that voice, the soft rasp, the way she said his name like she was half laughing, half warning. But this time, it had carried fear. Real, trembling fear. Richard crouched down slowly, picking up the phone with shaky hands. The screen flickered for a second, showing the words unknown caller, then went black again. He tried to turn it back on, but the battery had died. He stared at it in disbelief, his reflection faintly visible on the wet glass. The world suddenly felt colder, smaller. He wiped his face, trying to breathe. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks. Maybe the shock, the guilt, the exhaustion had finally broken something inside him. Or maybe someone wanted him to believe she was still alive. Inside the hall, laughter still echoed, warm and happy, a cruel contrast to the dread crawling beneath his skin. Through the glass door, he could see Daniel dancing again with his new wife, spinning her slowly beneath the golden lights. The sight should have filled him with pride, but now, all Richard felt was fear. He slipped quietly back inside, trying to blend in. The heat from the room hit him instantly, warming his soaked clothes but not the chill in his chest. He made his way to the far corner where the lights were dimmer, pretending to look for a drink. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the man in the gray suit he'd seen earlier. But there was no sign of him. For a moment, Richard considered telling Daniel about the detective, about Margaret, about the call. But what would he say? Son, I think a dead woman just called me. Daniel would think he'd lost his mind. And maybe he had. A soft voice startled him. Sir, are you all right? He turned quickly. It was the same young woman from earlier, one of the wedding staff, holding a tray of empty glasses. Her eyes were kind but curious. You look pale, she said softly. Would you like to sit down? Richard nodded slowly. Yes, maybe that's a good idea. She guided him toward a small table near the side exit. The light was softer there, the sound of music fading slightly. He sat down, trying to steady his breathing. Would you like some water? She asked. Yes, thank you. As she walked away, Richard's eyes fell to his hands, still trembling. The small velvet box was gone. His heart jumped. He checked his pockets frantically, his jacket, his seat. Nothing. The watch, his father's watch, the gift meant for Daniel, was gone. Panic rose in his chest. He stood quickly, scanning the floor. Had it fallen outside? Had someone taken it? Looking for something, a voice said behind him. He turned, and there he was. The man in the gray suit. Standing only a few feet away, holding a half-empty glass of wine, smiling faintly. Richard's throat went dry. Who are you? He asked quietly. The man tilted his head. Just someone who's been waiting to meet you. Richard's muscles tensed. Were you the one watching me outside? Watching, the man chuckled softly. No, Mr. Harris. I was observing. He took a slow sip from his glass. You have quite the talent for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Richard's heart sank. What do you want from me? The man's smile faded. You still don't understand, do you? Margaret tried to warn you. She told you to stay out of it. Richard froze. Stay out of what? The man leaned in slightly. You really don't remember? She said you were right. But she didn't say about what. Think, Mr. Harris. What did you tell her? Richard shook his head. I don't know. I didn't tell her anything important. We talked about ordinary things, her garden, her sister. Her sister, the man interrupted. Yes. The sister who doesn't exist. Richard stared. What? The man smirked. Margaret Dyer never had a sister. We checked. That story about her visiting someone out of town? It was her way of hiding something. Richard's stomach turned. How do you know all this? The man's expression darkened. Because I'm one of the people she was hiding from. Richard stepped back instinctively, his pulse thundering in his ears. You need to leave. Now. I'm not here to hurt you, the man said calmly. But if you keep digging into things you don't understand, others will. You weren't supposed to come tonight. You should have stayed away, Richard. Richard felt the room spinning. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. The man's voice was quiet but cold. Margaret made the same mistake. She thought she could protect you. But she didn't realize how deep this goes. Who are you? Richard demanded again. The man placed his glass down on the table, straightened his jacket, and gave a faint smile. Let's just say, I work for people who prefer their secrets buried. And with that, he turned and began walking toward the exit. Wait! Richard called out, following him. But as he reached the door, the man was gone, vanished into the rain. Richard stood there, breathing hard, his reflection shaking in the glass. His mind replayed the words, she told you to stay out of it. Stay out of what? What secret had Margaret died for? He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath the damp fabric of his suit. The key. He remembered the silver key in his pocket. Maybe it was connected. Maybe it unlocked something, a box, a drawer, a secret Margaret had left behind. He needed to leave. Now. As he turned to go, Daniel appeared beside him. Dad? What are you doing out here again? Richard flinched slightly, forcing a smile. Oh, I just needed some air. Long day. Daniel frowned. You look worried. Is everything all right? Richard hesitated. I'm fine. Really? Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay. But come back in soon. We're about to cut the cake. Richard smiled weakly. Of course. As Daniel walked away, Richard stood there for a moment longer, staring out into the rain. He knew he couldn't leave without saying goodbye, but he also couldn't stay. Whoever that man was, he wasn't lying. There was danger here, something tied to Margaret, something that somehow involved him. He turned and slipped quietly through the back door, walking fast toward the parking lot. The wind howled softly through the trees, carrying the faint echo of music and laughter from behind him. He pulled out his car keys, trying to steady his shaking hands. When he opened the door, a folded piece of paper was resting on the driver's seat. His name written across it. He froze. Slowly, he picked it up, his fingers trembling. The paper was wet around the edges but still readable. You were right, Richard. They know you have the key. Don't go home. His breath caught. He looked around quickly, the parking lot was empty. Only the rain and the shadows moved. He climbed into the car, locking the doors instantly. His mind was racing. They know you have the key. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small silver key. It was cold, heavier now, almost humming in his hand. What did it open? What was Margaret trying to protect? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't run from it. He started the car, glancing once more at the glowing windows of the wedding hall. His son was inside, happy, safe. For now. Then, as the engine roared to life, his headlights illuminated something in front of him, footprints in the mud, leading toward the dark woods behind the church. Fresh ones. And at the end of those prints, something small glimmered in the light, another piece of paper pinned to a wooden post. He stepped out slowly, the rain biting his skin. He tore the paper from the post and held it under the beam of the car light. In shaky handwriting, it read, "You can still save him." The rain had turned heavier now, drumming against the leaves, soaking Richard's suit until it clung to his skin like a layer of cold regret. He stood there in the dim beam of his car's headlights, staring at the note in his trembling hand. "You can still save him." The words didn't feel like a warning anymore, they felt like a countdown. Richard looked back toward the hall, where laughter and music still echoed faintly through the night. Daniel was inside, completely unaware that something terrible had begun to unfold just beyond those golden walls. He couldn't go back inside. Not now. Whoever left that note might still be watching. Whoever they were, they had already found him, and now, they were circling his son. The footprints in the mud were still fresh. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding painfully, and began to follow them. The path led away from the parking lot and down a narrow dirt trail that cut through the woods behind the church. The wind hissed through the branches, carrying faint whispers that could have been the rain, or something else. Every step felt heavier than the last, his shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground. He thought about Margaret again. Her laugh. Her small, careful handwriting. That last conversation they'd had on the phone months before she died. She had told him not to come to the wedding early, a strange thing to say at the time. He'd thought she was joking. But what if she had been trying to protect him? The trail curved deeper into the woods until he saw it, a faint light flickering ahead. It wasn't steady like a flashlight, it glowed and dimmed, almost pulsing. His body stiffened, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but something stronger pushed him forward. When he reached the source, he stopped. There, half buried under wet leaves and dirt, was a small wooden box, old, cracked, and faintly glowing where the light from the church barely touched it. He crouched down and brushed the dirt away with shaking fingers. The box was locked, with a small, circular keyhole. His hand went instinctively to his pocket. The silver key. For a moment, he just stared at it, his breath fogging in the cold air. Then, slowly, he pushed the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a faint click, the box opened. Inside was a folded envelope, a flash drive, and a small photograph, a young Margaret standing beside a tall man Richard didn't recognize. Behind them was a laboratory or some kind of research facility. A faint logo was visible on the wall, Echelon Systems. The name hit him like a wave. He remembered it. Margaret had once mentioned Echelon, said she'd worked there briefly, years ago, before she left without explanation. He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in her familiar handwriting. The ink had run slightly from the moisture, but he could still read it. Richard. If you are reading this, it means I failed to stop them. Echelon wasn't just research, it was surveillance. They've been watching people, tracking them, experimenting. I found out something I wasn't supposed to. I copied the data onto this drive. Don't take it to the police. Don't trust anyone connected to the government. Keep your son away from them. They know about Daniel. M. Dyer. Richard's heart sank. His fingers tightened around the paper until it nearly tore. They knew about Daniel. But why? What could his son possibly have to do with any of this? A sound behind him made him freeze. A faint crunch of leaves, footsteps. He turned quickly, scanning the darkness. The beam from his car lights barely reached this far, casting long, twitching shadows between the trees. For a moment, nothing moved. Then he saw it, a faint red light, like the reflection from a lens, watching him from between the trees. He snapped the box shut, pocketed the flash drive and the letter, and backed away slowly. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice shaking. No answer. Only the soft whisper of rain. Then, suddenly, a voice. Low, calm, too close. "Put the box down, Richard." He spun around, but no one was there. The voice came again, behind him this time. "You shouldn't have opened it." He turned again, his pulse hammering. "Show yourself." The rain fell harder now, masking sounds, making every direction feel the same. Then, through the dark, the shape of a man emerged, the same man in the gray suit. Only now, his smile was gone. "I warned you," the man said softly. "You should have left it buried." "What is this?" Richard demanded. "What do you want from my son?" The man shook his head slowly. "It's not about what we want from him. It's about what he is." Richard felt his stomach drop. "What are you talking about?" The man stepped closer, rain dripping from his hair. "Margaret worked for Echelon Systems." "So did you, though you probably don't remember." "I never." "You did," the man interrupted. "You signed off on a trial 28 years ago. Project Helios. Artificial neural imprinting. A study in generational data transfer. They needed volunteers, and your wife was pregnant at the time." Richard's voice broke. "That's impossible." "Is it?" the man asked. "Do you remember the hospital visit? The experimental ultrasound? The compensation check that came in the mail? That was Echelon. And Daniel was the result." Richard felt like the ground had vanished beneath him. His mind reeled, refusing to accept the words. "You're lying." The man took another step closer, his eyes cold and certain. "We don't lie, Mr. Harris. Your son carries something inside him, something Margaret tried to destroy. That's why she died." Richard backed away slowly, clutching the box against his chest. "You're insane." "Maybe," the man said. "But if you don't want to lose your son like she did, you'll hand over what's in that box." Richard hesitated. The rain was pouring harder now, lightning flashing faintly across the treetops. In that split second of white light, he saw something glinting at the man's waist, the outline of a gun. He turned and ran. Branches whipped against his face, mud splashed up his legs, his heart pounded in his throat. He could hear the man behind him shouting, his footsteps pounding closer. "Stop, Richard! You don't understand what you're doing." But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He burst through the trees, back toward the parking lot, his shoes slipping on the wet ground. The church lights were ahead, glowing like a promise of safety. But as he neared his car, another shape stepped out from behind it, another man, dressed in black, face shadowed beneath a hood. Richard froze. The first man's voice came from behind. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." He was trapped. He gripped the box tighter, his mind racing. Then, suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, the screen flickering back to life despite the dead battery. A single message blinked on the screen. "Unknown number, run to the bell tower." He didn't think. He just ran. He bolted past the car, across the gravel, through a narrow gate beside the church that led toward the old bell tower at the edge of the property. The two men shouted behind him, their footsteps close and heavy. The tower loomed ahead, dark, ancient, its wooden door hanging open. He rushed inside and slammed it shut behind him, his breath ragged. The space smelled of dust and rust. The sound of rain echoed faintly through the cracks in the old stone walls. He could hear the men outside, their voices muffled. Then, from above him, came a soft sound. Footsteps. Someone was already inside. Richard looked up slowly. A faint light flickered from the stairwell that spiraled upward. For a moment, fear locked him in place. Then a voice drifted down, gentle but urgent. "Richard, hurry. We don't have much time." He knew that voice. His heart stopped. It was Margaret. For a long moment, Richard didn't move. His legs felt like they had turned to stone. The voice that drifted from above, it couldn't be real. It couldn't be her. But it was. It was Margaret's voice. Soft. Breathless. And somehow, exactly as he remembered it. The rain hammered against the tower walls, seeping through the cracks, filling the silence with an eerie rhythm. The faint light above flickered again, a lantern maybe, or a phone. He couldn't tell. His hand gripped the wooden railing of the spiral staircase, slick with age and damp. He took a deep breath. "Margaret?" His voice came out shaky, unsure, almost afraid of the answer. "Please, Richard," the voice said again, trembling with urgency. "Hurry." He swallowed hard and began to climb. The stairs creaked beneath his weight, each step echoing upward through the hollow tower. The air grew colder as he ascended, his breath turning into faint mist. Shadows twisted around the old stones like fingers reaching out from another time. Halfway up, he stopped to listen. He could still hear movement above him, soft, hurried, and very real. But behind him, faintly, came another sound, the muffled voices of the men outside. They were searching. He didn't have much time. When he reached the top, the stairway opened into a small wooden chamber. The great bell hung above, motionless, a thin line of water dripping steadily from its edge. And there, standing near the broken window, holding a lantern, was Margaret. Richard froze. For a moment, the world stopped breathing. She looked older, thinner, her once bright hair streaked with gray, her face pale and tired. But it was her. The same eyes that had once looked at him with kindness, the same calm voice that used to fill their conversations with warmth. He took a step forward, his voice breaking. "Margaret, how?" "They said you were dead." She smiled faintly, sad and tired. "They wanted you to believe that." Richard's heart pounded. But the letter, the funeral, the detective. "All lies," she said softly. "They staged it. Echelon couldn't risk me talking. I was too close to exposing them." He shook his head slowly, unable to process it. "I don't understand any of this. They said you were helping me. Then I got your call." "Yes," she interrupted, stepping closer. "I tried to warn you. But I didn't know they'd already found you." Richard stared at her, disbelief mixing with fear. "Who are they, Margaret? What do they want with Daniel?" She looked toward the window, lightning flashing across her face. "Echelon isn't a company anymore. It's a network, hidden under government contracts, private labs, medical programs. They were working on something called Project Helios. You remember the study, don't you? The one you and your wife joined when Daniel was still unborn?" Richard's mouth went dry. "That was a medical trial. They said it was about prenatal health." Margaret nodded grimly. "That's what they told everyone. But it wasn't. They were experimenting with data imprinting, using genetic memory to carry information through bloodlines. Daniel was part of it. His DNA carries encrypted patterns, fragments of an AI system they couldn't store anywhere else. Your son isn't infected, Richard. He's a living drive. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. He staggered back a step, shaking his head. No. That's insane. I wish it were, Margaret whispered. But it's real. They've been monitoring him for years. Every time he visits a hospital, every scan, every test, they see everything. And now that he's married, they're worried that whatever's inside him might spread to another line. Richard stared at her in horror. Spread? What does that even mean? Margaret lowered her gaze. I don't know. But I know this, once they get to him, they won't let him live. The words hit him like a blow. His hands trembled as he pulled the box from his coat. I found this. I used the key. There was a flash drive inside, your letter, your photo. She looked at it, her eyes softening. You kept it safe. I didn't know what it meant, he said. I still don't. Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice. That flash drive has data from Echelon's core servers. It proves everything. But there's something you don't know. The key you used to open that box wasn't just a key, Richard. It's part of the same code. Once you turned it, they knew where you were. Richard's blood ran cold. They're coming here, aren't they? She nodded. Yes. As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly from below. Heavy boots climbing the stairs. Voices. Low. Urgent. Richard turned toward the stairwell. We have to leave. There's no time, Margaret said, grabbing his arm. Listen to me, you need to protect Daniel. Take the drive and go to the old observatory north of the city. There's someone there named Dr. Rain. She was part of Helios before she escaped. She'll know what to do. He shook his head. I'm not leaving you here. She smiled faintly. You don't have a choice. The footsteps were closer now, echoing like drumbeats through the narrow tower. Margaret moved quickly toward the window, pushing open a wooden panel behind the old bell. There was a small service ladder leading down the outer wall. Go, she said urgently. It leads to the back field. Take it and run. He hesitated. What about you? She looked back at him, her eyes wet. I'll hold them off. Margaret. Go, Richard. The door below burst open with a crash. Shouts filled the tower. Richard clutched the flash drive and started down the ladder. The wind whipped at his face, cold and sharp, the rain blurring everything into streaks of silver. Above him, he heard shouting, then the sound of a struggle. He climbed faster, his hands slipping on the wet rungs. He hit the ground hard and ran toward the backfield, his legs burning, lungs aching. Behind him, a single gunshot split the air. He froze. For a moment, everything went silent except for the rain. Then, another shot. No, he whispered, turning toward the tower. The top window flickered with movement, then a shadow fell. Something heavy hit the ground near the base of the wall. Richard's heart broke. Margaret! He stumbled toward the tower, but a voice shouted from above. Stop! Don't move! Flashlights cut through the darkness, 2-3 beams sweeping the field. He turned and ran again, clutching the flash drive so tightly it dug into his palm. He could hear them behind him, their boots slapping through the mud, their shouts blending with thunder. He reached the line of trees at the edge of the property and disappeared into the woods. His mind screamed at him to stop, to think, but his heart pushed him forward. Every branch that whipped across his face, every stone that caught his foot, none of it mattered. All that mattered was getting out alive, for Daniel's sake. By the time he reached the road, his body was shaking, his breath ragged, and his heart pounding with both fear and sorrow. He turned once more toward the tower. Smoke. A faint orange glow. Then, silence. He sank to his knees on the side of the empty road, rain washing the dirt from his face, tears mixing with the storm. Margaret was gone. Again. But this time, there was no letter. No lie. Only truth, and a drive in his pocket that could destroy the people who had taken everything. He whispered her name once, softly, then looked up through the rain at the dark horizon. Somewhere out there was Dr. Rain, and maybe, a chance to finally end this. But as he got up and started toward his car, his phone buzzed again in his pocket. Unknown number. A single new message. We have your son. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Richard reached his car again, but the silence it left behind was worse than the storm. The wipers dragged across the windshield, squealing against the glass, while his trembling hands gripped the steering wheel. The phone lay on the passenger seat, the message still glowing like a wound. We have your son. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. His heart felt like it was caught between two beats, one full of rage, the other of fear. He dialed Daniel's number again and again, but every time, it went straight to voicemail. The last time he'd seen his son, he had been smiling, dancing, his wife's hand in his, the lights of the wedding glowing around them like a dream. And now, someone had taken him. Richard slammed his hand against the dashboard. No, he whispered. Not again. He had already lost Margaret twice, once in a lie, once for real. He wasn't about to lose Daniel too. He opened the glove box, pulled out a folded map, and searched for the name Margaret had given him, the old observatory north of the city. It was marked as abandoned, sitting at the edge of a forested valley. If Dr. Rain was there, she was his only hope. He started the car, tires splashing through puddles as he sped down the narrow, twisting road. The world outside blurred into streaks of gray and black. His mind raced with questions. How did they get Daniel? Where did they take him? What did they want to do? He drove for almost an hour, until the city lights faded behind him and the road narrowed into gravel. The observatory appeared at the top of a hill, a dome of cracked metal and broken glass, surrounded by trees that leaned like tired sentinels. He parked at the base and climbed the steep path on foot, his breath coming out in sharp clouds. The air smelled of rust and pine. Every few seconds, he looked over his shoulder, expecting headlights or movement in the woods. But there was nothing. Only the quiet hum of distant thunder. When he reached the main door, he found it half open. A faint light flickered from inside, a single bulb swaying on a wire. He stepped in cautiously. The place was old, half collapsed, filled with dust and forgotten machinery. Old telescopes lay broken on the floor, their lenses cracked. Maps of the stars clung to the walls, yellowed and torn. Dr. Rain, he called softly. No answer. He moved deeper inside, his shoes crunching on debris. Then, from the back of the room, a voice spoke quietly. You shouldn't have come alone. He turned sharply. A woman stepped out from behind a control panel, wearing a long coat and carrying a tablet that glowed faint blue. Her face was thin, her hair tied back, her expression calm but wary. Dr. Rain? He asked. She nodded. You must be Richard Harris. His shoulders sagged with relief. Margaret told me to find you. She said you could help. Dr. Rain's face changed slightly, a flicker of sadness. Margaret, she didn't make it, did she? Richard's voice broke. No. They killed her. They're coming for my son next. She sighed softly. Then we don't have much time. She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the observatory. Did you bring the drive? He pulled it from his pocket and handed it to her. She plugged it into her tablet, the screen filling with lines of shifting code and documents marked Echelon Systems Confidential. For several minutes, she said nothing, her eyes darting quickly over the data. Then she looked up, her voice tight. This is everything. Project Helios. The neural encoding patterns. Margaret must have risked her life to steal this. Richard leaned closer. Tell me what it means. Tell me what they did to my son. Dr. Rain hesitated, then turned the screen toward him. It showed a diagram, a human brain, filled with faint glowing circuits. They found a way to encode artificial intelligence within human DNA, she said quietly. A living host, one that can think, adapt, evolve. Daniel isn't carrying a disease. He's carrying an intelligence. It's been dormant all his life, waiting for activation. Richard stared, horrified. Activated? By who? By them, she said. Echelon designed the signal years ago. A specific frequency that can wake the embedded code. They've been preparing for this moment, and tonight, during the wedding, they triggered it. He felt his blood run cold. You mean it's already happening? Dr. Rain nodded. They'll want to control him before it's complete. If they fail, whatever is inside him will fully awaken, and no one knows what that means. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. So my son, he's not. He's human, she interrupted softly. But he's also more. A hybrid of biology and data. A bridge between us and what they created. He swallowed hard. Then we have to stop them. Tell me where they've taken him. Dr. Rain's fingers flew over the tablet. A map appeared, an old facility near the coast, marked with the same symbol he'd seen in the photo behind Margaret. Echelon's coastal lab, she said. That's where they'll bring him. Richard took a deep breath. Then that's where I'm going. You can't go alone, she said quickly. They'll kill you before you get within a mile. I don't care, he said. He's my son. She studied him for a long moment, then handed him a small device, a black cube no bigger than a matchbox. This emits an interference pulse. It can disrupt their tracking for about 30 minutes. It's not much, but it's something. He took it and nodded. Thank you. As he turned to leave, Dr. Rain said softly, Richard, if you reach him, don't try to wake him if he's already under the signal. The AI inside him, once it's aware, it might not recognize you. He looked back at her, his face pale. Then I'll remind him who he is. The drive back toward the coast felt endless. The rain returned, harder now, washing the world in silver and shadow. His headlights cut through the darkness, reflecting off the sea in the distance. As he neared the cliffs, he saw it, a massive facility hidden behind a wall of steel and concrete, its lights glowing faint through the fog. Guard towers. Security drones. Electric fences. He parked his car in the trees, far enough away to avoid detection, and crept down the narrow path toward the perimeter. Every sound, every gust of wind, every snapping twig, made his pulse race. He reached the fence and activated the black cube. The device hummed softly, sending ripples through the air. For a brief moment, the red lights on the fence flickered, and Richard climbed through, landing silently on the other side. He moved carefully along the side of the building, searching for an entrance. Then he saw it, a side door slightly open, faint light spilling out. Voices echoed from inside. He crept closer and peered through the gap. Two men stood near a table, talking in low voices. And on that table, strapped down, surrounded by cables and monitors, was Daniel. Richard's heart stopped. His son was unconscious, pale, his chest rising and falling slowly. Electrodes were attached to his temples, wires running into a large machine that pulsed faint blue light. One of the men spoke into a headset. Phase 1 complete. Neural pattern stabilization in progress. The other adjusted a control. What about his vitals? Strong. The systems merging perfectly. Merging. Richard's fists clenched. He could feel rage building in his chest, drowning out the fear. He had seen enough. Quietly, he pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. "Step away from him," he said, his voice low and deadly. Both men turned, startled. One reached for his weapon, but Richard was faster. He slammed the metal tray beside him into the man's arm, sending the gun skidding across the floor. The second man lunged, but Richard drove his shoulder into his ribs, knocking him against the wall. The machine beside Daniel began to beep rapidly, lights flashing. Richard turned and tore the cables from his son's head, shouting his name. "Daniel! It's me! Wake up!" For a moment, there was nothing. Then Daniel's eyes opened, but they were glowing faint blue, the same color as the machine. Richard froze. "Daniel?" His son blinked slowly, his voice strange, layered, human, but not. "Father, you shouldn't have come." The room seemed to hold its breath. Richard stood frozen in place, staring at his son, or whatever Daniel had become. The blue light in his eyes flickered like electricity, faint but alive. Machines hummed around them, cables twitching on the floor like veins under skin. Richard's hands trembled. "Daniel," he whispered, taking a step forward, his voice breaking. "It's me, your father." Daniel blinked slowly, his face expressionless. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, calm, but layered with something artificial beneath the surface. "I remember you," he said. "I remember the house by the river. I remember Mom's laughter. But the memories, they don't feel like mine anymore." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to rush to him, to pull him into his arms and tell him it was okay, but something about the way Daniel looked at him made him hesitate. It wasn't hatred. It was confusion, like someone staring into a mirror and seeing two reflections. "What did they do to you?" Richard whispered. Daniel looked around slowly, his gaze falling on the machine beside him. "They woke it up," he said softly. "The thing inside me. I can feel it, it's thinking, learning, spreading through my mind. I can see everything it sees. The network. The signals. All of it." He looked back at his father. "They wanted me to be the bridge between man and machine. But now, it's breaking me apart." Richard moved closer, shaking his head. "No. You're stronger than them. You can fight this." Daniel smiled faintly, almost sadly. "You still believe that, even after everything?" "I have to," Richard said. "You're my son." For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and fragile. Then the door burst open, and armed guards flooded in. Shouts echoed, guns raised, red lights flashing across the metal walls. Richard turned instinctively, shielding Daniel with his body. "Stay behind me." But Daniel stood tall, his expression calm. "No, Dad. Stay back." Before Richard could speak, Daniel raised his hand. The lights above flickered, then exploded, showering sparks through the room. The guards froze mid-step, their weapons short-circuiting in their hands. A low hum filled the air, growing louder, deeper, until the walls themselves seemed to vibrate. The blue glow in Daniel's eyes brightened, and suddenly, the entire facility's power died. The monitors went black. The alarms silenced. Outside, through the small window, Richard saw the drones drop from the sky like stones. Then Daniel fell to his knees. Richard ran to him, catching him before he hit the ground. His son's skin was cold, his breathing shallow. "Daniel! Look at me!" Daniel's eyes fluttered open. The blue light was fading, flickering like a dying flame. "I stopped them," he whispered. "The signal. The system. It's gone." Richard shook his head desperately. "No, no, stay with me. We can still fix this. Dr. Rain can." "There's nothing to fix," Daniel interrupted weakly. "It was never meant to last. The thing inside me, it wasn't human. It was trying to overwrite me. But I made sure it couldn't." Tears stung Richard's eyes. You didn't have to do this alone. Daniel smiled faintly. You were late once, Dad, but you came back. That's all I ever wanted. Richard held him tighter, his heart breaking with every word. Please. Don't leave me. Not like this. But Daniel's body was growing limp. His breathing slowed, his voice barely a whisper. Tell Mom I heard her singing. At the wedding. I could hear her in the music. Richard's tears fell onto his son's face. I will. I promise. Daniel's lips curved into a soft, peaceful smile. Then it's okay. And just like that, the light in his eyes went out. The silence that followed was unbearable. The machines around them lay dead, the facility bathed in cold moonlight from the shattered roof. Outside, the rain began again, slow, gentle, almost like a farewell. Richard sat there for what felt like hours, holding his son's body, unable to move. All the noise, the anger, the chaos, it was gone now. There was only him, and the echo of what he had lost. When he finally stood, dawn was breaking over the ocean. The first light touched the waves, painting them silver. He looked at Daniel one last time, brushed a hand through his hair, and whispered, You saved them all. He carried his son out of the facility, past the broken machines and silent guards. The forest outside was quiet, the air cool and wet. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. At the edge of the cliff, Richard stopped and looked out at the horizon. The world looked the same, but he knew it wasn't. His son's sacrifice had shut down something far bigger than either of them, something that could have destroyed everything human. He took a deep breath, feeling both the pain and pride in his chest. You were right, Daniel, he murmured. Some things are worth saving. As he turned to leave, the sun rose higher, spilling light across the trees and the sea. The day had come, a new one, quiet and uncertain. Richard walked down the hill toward his car, the morning wind brushing past him like a whisper. For the first time in years, he didn't feel afraid of what was next. He reached the car, opened the door, and looked up one last time toward the sky. Somewhere, he hoped, his son was free, not as a machine or a weapon, but as a soul finally at peace. He started the engine, the road stretching endlessly ahead. And as the music played softly from the radio, a familiar song from the wedding, he smiled through his tears. Goodbye, son, he whispered. You'll always be with me. The car disappeared down the road, the morning sun following behind it like a promise. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every story I tell is a journey, and every listener helps it live a little longer.